Full disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad. Trump, China, trade wars, the slowdown, the radioactive prince, un-Brexit, a kinder, gentler burger. Presenting the world in 2019 by way of The Economist magazine. Do stay with us. This episode is made possible by Evo Advisors, helping busy professionals who have more than a 401k plan to worry about. Evo Advisors, offering clients financial advice. Fiduciaries for families. evoadvisors.com. And by Performance Food Service, a proud partner of Virginia restaurants and food service establishments, with more than 13,000 associates in 75 locations nationwide. Online at pfgc.com. Joining us from London in the United Kingdom, which is still, I believe, part of the European Union, is Tom Standage, deputy editor of The Economist, where he helped oversee the World in 2019 issue. Sir, how are you?
I'm very well. Great to be here.
So many hotspots on our planet, so many if-then scenarios and pockets of uncertainty, whether you look at MBS in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, Xi in China, Netanyahu, whether he keeps his job in Israel by the end of the year, Facebook, which you followed closely, Putin, Bolsonaro, populism in the Western Hemisphere. Where, pray tell, does one start?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. And with this issue that we put together once a year where we try to imagine the year ahead, we actually start the previous May. So we're about to almost start on the world in 2020, or at least in sort of 4 or 5 months. And so we are really trying to look for the very long-running themes and how they might turn into important events in the following year. So it's pretty tricky. And obviously we then get to course correct until the November when the issue comes out. But yes, it is quite tricky. And particularly it's been tricky the last couple of years because the news has been so extraordinary and so unpredictable that producing this annual has become a lot more difficult than it used to be.
Well, then might I channel my American-centric American by citing your article, your column on Joe Biden being not the best person to take on Donald Trump, to the extent we're already seeing Elizabeth Warren, the popular U.S. senator from Massachusetts, come out and establish at least her exploratory committee. You are going to have a kind of a lemming effect or penguins hopping off the boulder, if you will, and more of a field forming. But I was struck to see that you guys came out and effectively told the presumptive frontrunner that the Democrats need someone who can offer a fresh face and new ideas, and Amtrak Joe would not be that person.
Yes, I can see, I can see the case for him, but I can also see the case against. There is a theory that each president has to be the opposite of the previous president. And obviously, Donald Trump is the opposite of Barack Obama in so many ways. And the question is, for the Democrats, what's the opposite of Donald Trump? And there are many possible answers to that. And it could be Elizabeth Warren, it could be Kamala Harris. Maybe a competent white man is the answer. But it's a tough one. And I think the real question is, how are they going to peel people off the Republicans? And it may be that a white man is the answer, but then is Joe Biden the right man? Is Beto a better bet? So obviously, as we see these announcements coming out in the next few months and we start to get some polling data and we start to see, crucially, I think, how Trump defines his opponents. I mean, he hasn't had an opponent to rail against since Hillary disappeared from the scene, and he's started to get Nancy Pelosi, but he's going to have to come up with a whole load of nicknames for people who he hasn't had to fight against directly. And one of the things we think is that this is actually going to possibly help Trump because he's never happier than when he has somebody to belittle and somebody to attack. So I think a big part of this is how all of these candidates stack up when they're faced with the playground bully behavior that we know that Donald Trump is so capable of.
Tom, I'm in D.C. often, and I hear these rumblings about the country needs a healing ticket with an avuncular figure like Joe Biden, maybe promising to only be there for one term. After all, he is quite old. Would he be the oldest candidate to ever run for the Democratic Party?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not an expert on those sort of statistics, I'm afraid.
The column goes into how elderly he looked on this flight with the correspondent, and it struck. They asked the voter, and it's like, I didn't realize he looked that elderly. But this idea that maybe he could pair with a greenhorn like Beto O'Rourke, the shiny object out of Texas who gave Cruz a run for his money in the midterm elections, or a Kamala Harris or someone else who could then presumptively take on the 2024 baton.
No, I mean, obviously, he would have to have a younger person on the ticket. Well, pretty much anyone would be a younger person on the ticket, but he would have to have someone who would represent a fresh face and reaching out and a sort of the future of the party, and that would probably have to be a non-white woman. But I think we're so at the beginning of this. I mean, we're how far from the election now, and we don't know who's going to declare. We don't know who's going to not declare. We don't know how people are going to react to any of these potential candidates. So I think we're going to have plenty of time to speculate about all of this. And what intrigues me about 2019 is there's a whole load of things that we know are going to happen next year or could happen next year before we even get to 2020. I mean, one of them, yes, is that the 2020 race is starting, but there's a whole load of other things going on in 2019 where speculation is potentially more fruitful, I think.
Well, talk to me then about the situation with a divided Washington, D.C. finally, that the Democrats did get a quiet wave and restored a majority in the lower house. And right now we are at an impasse where nothing is going on. You're hearing about national parks and their bathrooms being left dirty and people relieving themselves on the road, unfortunately.
Oh, it's amazing, isn't it? All the reports from Joshua Tree and things, it's astonishing.
Well, both sides have effectively dug in their heels. You are going to see the Democrats sworn in and new faces coming in, and you kind of almost have to resist the urge to have subpoena after subpoena after subpoena because Trump, of course, knows how to play that to his advantage and play kind of the victimology card. Where do you see that headed at the very least, the relationship, the marriage of convenience over the next 6 months?
I think the big danger is that the Democrats overreach, and they are so desperate to investigate everything and to just spend all of their energy having a go at Trump. And clearly, there is a need for some accountability, and there are lots of things that need to be looked into. But it's very interesting, even with what they're talking about doing on the first day that they come into power this week. They are talking about looking, actually trying to get things done straight away. There's various things they want to do on healthcare. Obviously, they want to get the government restarted straight away. So I think if they can continue like that, which is showing that they are doing things that are actually governing and not just using the fact that they control the House to have a go at Trump, I think they've got to strike the right balance. There's also going to be a large part of their base who do want them to just spend their time doing nothing but going after Trump. But that could just very easily play into his hands. I mean, he could just then say it really is a witch hunt and they need to prevent that from becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Now, talk to me hemispherically. You guys pointed out, The Economist did, that we have 3 populists elected to the 3 most populous nations in the hemisphere. The United States, Mexico with Lopez Obrador, and Brazil with the fiery Jair Bolsonaro. Yeah. That is kind of unprecedented in our recollection. This hasn't happened ever. And you seem to see Washington sending kisses to this right-wing leader in Brazil. It's really bizarre. Strange bedfellows with Bibi Netanyahu in Israel and the new leader of Brazil who has made overtures to the right wing and some potentially anti-Semitic elements in his past, but that's all water under the bridge right now.
Yeah, apparently he's also talking about a Christian axis between Brazil, the United States and Russia, which is a sort of weird combination that I hadn't thought of before. It is extraordinary, and it is very tempting to see all of these people as mini Trumps and, like Duterte as well. I mean, they seem to be popping up all over the place. And the thing about Bolsonaro is he is an unsavory character in many ways, but he was chosen because he promised Trump-like to do something about the swamp, as it were, the car wash scandal and the general corruption in Brazil. And he's appointed a judge who's very popular to lead the campaign against corruption. So. And he's also talked and made a lot of kind of quite encouraging noises about reviving the economy. So, but it's very hard to know, whether the sort of good Bolsonaro or the bad Bolsonaro will predominate. And so it's going to be very interesting to see in the coming months how that plays out, and also what his relations are with leaders in other countries, both those who are aligned with him ideologically, like Trump is, and those who aren't.
Now, I have, to take us back across the pond, across the Atlantic to your homeland. Alas, I have a wonderful transitional device here. 1858 was the Great Stink of London on the Thames. And 160 years after that, you have this metaphorical Great Stink of Brexit. Was that too tortured, sir?
Well, 1858 for me is also the year that America and Europe were first connected by telegraph wire. So that's what comes into mind for me when you think about that period. But yes, there is this. Is it a stink? I mean, it's paralysed British
Well,
politics.
Parliament isn't covering the drapes in lime to kind of conceal the stench right now, but certainly, I mean, this acrimony and this fear and loathing, and did we make a mistake, and what's going to happen, and very few people can name the Prime Minister of the UK.
Yeah, it's not as bad as Australia, but yes. No, well, the truthful answer is that no one knows where this is headed. And what's striking is that if you look at the parliamentary arithmetic, there is not, it seems, a majority in favour of the deal that Theresa May, the Prime Minister, has negotiated with the European Union about leaving. And the only thing there does seem to be a majority for is not trying to leave with no deal at all, so a so-called no-deal exit, where you just sort of walk away. And most people think that would cause absolute chaos at the ports. It would be very difficult to guarantee the supply of medicine and food, a lot of which Britain imports from Europe, and that would be a big mess. So given that Parliament is opposed to that, but can't decide on any of the other alternatives, that leaves various things like, should we have another general election? Should we have a second referendum? Should we try to go back to Europe and negotiate another deal, even though they say they won't do another deal? None of the other alternatives are doable by March the 29th, which is when we're supposed to be leaving. And actually, even if they manage to get Theresa May's deal through Parliament this month, it looks like it would be very difficult to get all of the legislation you'd then need to pass through either. So it does suggest that there's going to have to be some kind of delay no matter what happens. And then that's very messy, because if you delay Brexit, which is supposed to happen at the end of March, if you delay it to, say, the middle of the year, well, then you've got the European elections coming up in May, which at the moment Brits are not supposed to be voting in because we'll have left. So we don't need to elect Euro MPs anymore. So it all starts to get messier and messier. And so what we were hoping was that there would be some kind of resolution this year to this. And it may be that it's going to just all drag on for even longer than we think it is. Even the other thing to point out is that this thing that's being argued about at the moment is the terms of the exit. And even then, even if you could agree on that, you've got many, many years of negotiating what the future relationship between Britain and Europe looks like. And that's essentially doing a very, very big trade deal. And we can see from the amount of time it's taken Europe to do trade deals with places like Canada I think it took something like 8 or 9 years to do the Canada deal. That is potentially going to take many years as well. So Britain is going to be in Brexit limbo for the foreseeable future. That's the really tragic thing about it. And that means that politicians aren't doing anything else. It means businesses are paralysed. They don't know whether they can invest or not. There's just massive uncertainty, and it's just massively unhelpful.
Tom, why isn't a character like Jeremy Corbyn going after, kind of sensing blood in the water and going in for the kill, that he would galvanize some sort of opposition to, you guys proposed this, you put it on our plate, and it's now time to push through a referendum and correct this mistake? Is it that he himself is not particularly popular? Can you school me on this? It's
not that he isn't popular. So the weird thing is that among the party members who joined the Labour Party after Jeremy Corbyn became leader, there are a lot of people who will follow him no matter what he says, and he is actually not a fan of the EU. So he would very much like to leave. He says he'd like to leave because he would like to do things like nationalise some industries and provide more support, government support for industries, so sort of classic left-wing policies. And he says that EU law prevents him from doing that. So by leaving, he'll be able to do things like, get British manufacturing back on its feet and all this sort of thing. This doesn't seem to be true, though. So all of the things that Labour said in its last manifesto about wanting to do this were tested. There's quite a lot of European countries that like propping up industries and doing the sorts of things he likes doing. So that doesn't seem to be true. It just seems to be a sort of convenient excuse for why he wants to leave. So you've got this weird situation where the members of the party who joined, the sort of rank and file members of the party, are behind him, but the members of Parliament are actually mostly opposed to this. And so you've got this weird split. And if you look at, most polls in this country, I think something like 60% of Labour supporters would like a second referendum. But Jeremy Corbyn himself doesn't want it. His MPs would probably support one, but he doesn't want it. But his actual hardcore party members are opposed to it. And so he's got this contrast that he doesn't want to annoy his base. And he also worries about, there are hardcore pockets of resistance to Brexit. Sorry, support for Brexit Brexit, particularly in the north, in Labour supporting seats, and he worries about losing those traditional areas of Labour support if he turns around and says, actually, we're going to give up on Brexit, or even if we have a second referendum. So yeah, I mean, on the face of it, the logical thing for him to do, given this contradiction, is say, let's have a second referendum. Let the people decide. We politicians don't seem to be able to do it, but he just can't bring himself to do it.
Who then is the torchbearer for continued globalization or rapprochement with the rest of the continent?
Well, there aren't very many people. And essentially what a lot of politicians are doing are they're sitting on their hands, they're waiting for this to be resolved because they don't want to. If you're a centrist, sensible politician, the best thing for you to do, I mean, some of them are sort of campaigning for a second referendum, but a lot of them are just sort of keeping their heads down, because then once the decision has been made, they can, whatever it is, they can say, well, the decision's been made, it's all done, and now let's move forward. And that way, you're not sort of tying yourself to one side or another. So there's quite a lot of sort of constructive ambiguity going on here, not just from Jeremy Corbyn. And that's a problem. It means we don't have people who are prepared to really step forward in the front line of politics and say, this is a stupid idea, and we should all just say, we should admit that, or this is a stupid idea and we should have a second referendum to make sure that people still really want to do it. There really isn't a huge amount of that happening. Instead, it's sort of a groundswell of people. The one of the sort of merits, if you like, of the People's Vote movement is it doesn't really have a leader. It's lots of people saying this is a stupid idea. We should just rethink the whole thing.
Full disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad. You are listening to Tom Standage. He is deputy editor of The Economist, where he helped oversee the World in 2019 issue. He joins us from London. Tom, I am struck looking back at this New York Times glowing coverage of Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia's visit to the U.S. I mean, wearing jeans, a sporty blazer, looked very much Silicon Valley. He's there with the co-founder of Google. He saw Oprah, Rupert Murdoch. He went to Harvard, met Mayor Mike Bloomberg. I think they went to a Starbucks together. And he had one job. One job is just keep up that facade. Everything was going so well. Israel was suddenly best friends with Riyadh. And yet you have the Khashoggi murder in the fall, which completely turned world opinion against this person, and now he's radioactive. How, if at all, does he recover from this?
Well, it looks like he is going to hang on. I mean, the king has kept him in place and has moved a few of the people around him around in a way that strengthens his position. So they do seem to be wanting to just tough this out. The surprising thing about Khashoggi is that he was. He didn't actually. We interviewed him in, I think, May of 2018, and he was saying, I'm not trying to. I don't actually support regime change. He was criticising the regime, but he was saying it needed to reform itself. He wasn't saying, let's have a full democracy or anything. And yet, even that was sort of deemed unacceptable. So what's really astonishing is how sort of unradical some of the things he was saying were. It's just he had a very prominent platform, and evidently that that.
Yeah,
was...
I didn't look at him as like like for example when Nigeria killed the poet and playwright, and the government suffered the consequences for this. The cheap opposition voice in it. If anything, I thought he was close to the regime, and at the very least, let's channel Machiavelli in this case. Could you not have just kidnapped the person or roughed him up a bit or scared him? I mean, what was? How can you're assuming that the person was rational in doing this? There was so much to lose.
I think
was he not
very
mindful of this?
That's what's kind of worrying about it. It does suggest a lack of judgment, doesn't it? Because I mean, this is really he was not calling for the downfall of the regime, and yet even so, these criticisms were deemed to be intolerable, and I think that shows you how thin-skinned MBS must be. So evidently he's going to hold on, and the king has decided to leave him in place as crown prince, and so I don't think anything's going to change on that front this year. But we are seeing the implications of this in the business interests of the Saudi sovereign wealth fund and so on. And people are saying they don't want to be associated with it anymore. People leaving and so forth. And it's obviously very bad for them just from a purely financial point of view, and it also deals a blow to this. A fatal blow to this image that MBS had managed to craft, that he was going to be liberalising and reforming. And obviously, he did this very symbolic thing of allowing women to drive. And our editor-in-chief, Zani, went to Saudi Arabia on the day when it became allowed and actually, drove a car. Wow. So, it all seemed to be going so well. And yes, this sort of misjudgment has just meant that it's all of that has come to an end. And that very glowing persona that he'd managed to create is we're now all saying we got it wrong, and we shouldn't have said all those nice things about how optimistic we were.
I have to ask you, whenever I see headlines about this incident at the consulate in Turkey, which surely they must have been mindful that there must be microphones in place, or the regimes are not exactly 100% besties and they trust each other to do this. And the ruler of Turkey, Erdogan, has been dripping embarrassing intel on this event, and it's caused the Saudis to look, oh gosh, we didn't realize, or they covered it up initially. But I'm also tempted to think of the extrajudicial assassination attempt, I know that's redundant, of the Salisbury incident in the UK with the attempted murder of Russian
a former Russian spy. Yeah, that's right.
With the Novichok incident, and then the Soviet, and then I wonder, stepping back from if Putin and MBS are just saying kind of the impunity is abundant. We're not afraid of this. We're not afraid if the world knows we're trying to BS through this. That these things are related. And you mentioned Duterte earlier, and Duterte can get away with any sort of extrajudicial killing in Manila. That this is the kind of world we just live in right now, because you're not going to get a full-throated opposition response from the White House.
Well, I think that is fair. I think in the case of, I would say MBS is in a slightly different category, because I think in the case of Putin, Putin wanted to send a message, I think, that with the attempt on Skripal, which was that you're not safe anywhere, and even if you think you are, you're not. And I think that was the message that, because it was so obviously them, but also by lying about it and by saying, no, it wasn't us and these were tourists and all of the other kind of nonsense. I mean, this is, Putin invented this playbook where you just, whenever something bad happens, you flood the zone with different explanations. I mean, I remember when that plane got shot down over Ukraine, and they came up with all these ridiculous possible other stories. And there were so many of them that, no one can tell what the truth is anymore, because there are all of these different theories. And Putin is just a master at that. But he also knows that the direct lie that everyone knows is a lie, but no one can do anything about, is a very, very visible expression of power. And Trump uses this technique quite a lot as well. I mean, he repeatedly says things that aren't true, but in a way he's saying, who can stop me? I can make my own reality by saying these things. And Duterte, again, by admitting to various crimes in his past, firstly he thinks they make him look like a tough guy, and secondly he's sort of saying, no one can stop me. It's an expression of power. I think in MBS's case, I don't think this was meant. I think they literally thought that they'd make this guy disappear, and everyone would say, "Oh, where's he gone?" And it would be a mystery, and it would be unresolved. And the fact that the Turks turned out to have bugged the embassy, which is a big no-no diplomatically, but it turned out that they did. And the Turks came up with this theory that they tried to float through a state-friendly newspaper, that Khashoggi's Apple Watch had recorded everything, and that this had somehow been how they'd found out about it. So obviously the Turks didn't want to admit that they had bugs in the embassy, but they came up with this sort of plausible. I mean, if you don't think about it too hard, it turns out it's not plausible, because it turns out that Apple Watches with cellular connections don't work in Turkey. And then, of course, it turns out you can hack them so that they do. So it all just became this kind of ridiculous. How can you prove that it wasn't really that? And that was really what the Turks wanted. They just wanted some very, very slender read, which they could say, well, it wasn't us recording it, and somehow the audio is there, and we don't need to go into it. Anyway, had they not had this really incontrovertible evidence, then maybe they would have been able to have this sort of mysterious disappearance. But I don't think it was meant to have been discovered and then a warning to other people, or a sort of demonstration of anyone's power. And I think that's the difference with the kind of thing that Putin does. Putin does obviously stupid or obviously made up thing. I mean, my favourite one was when he discovered a an urn, an ancient Greek urn on the bottom of the Black Sea. He went scuba diving and, oh, look, there was an urn, and he discovered it. And of course, it had just been taken out of a museum. You've never seen just a clean urn on the bottom of the sea. All the time when he went to the zoo and some tigers escaped, and he just happened to be holding a gun with tranquilizer darts in it. So he shot the tiger with a tranquilizer dart, and all of the people at the zoo were like, "Oh, thank you for saving us." And then just the other day he was playing. He put his ice skates on and he went and played in a celebrity ice hockey match, and amazingly he scored 5 goals. And the Reuters report on the match.
This happens with the dear leader of North Korea too.
Yeah, exactly.
That's 4 holes in one in a row.
I think the first time he ever played golf, he got 9 holes in one on the first round. Yes, exactly. But no, Putin. I mean, in Putin's case, everyone knows it's rubbish. Well, not everyone, but I mean, most people know this is rubbish. But he's kind of saying, "Yeah, who's going to stop me?" And it is a demonstration of his power. Yeah, the Reuters report said that the netminder in the hockey match looked like they were sort of actively trying to get out of the way. The worst thing they could possibly have done was accidentally blocked the goal, because then they would have got into trouble. So yeah, this kind of and in fact we have a piece in the World in 2019 issue where we talk about this sort of appropriation of reality TV tropes and memes by world leaders, and Putin has launched a reality show in 2018 as a way of trying to improve his ratings. He's got terrible ratings at the moment, which is one of the reasons that he's up to no good in Ukraine again. Next to Ukraine by Crimea, and it's essentially it's all a ploy to try and rebuild his really quite terrible ratings at the moment.
Well, Tom, the footnote on the Novichok attack is, I wonder, has British intelligence broadly been emasculated? Aren't you supposed to see some sort of response? I mean, I understand you have Parliament and Theresa May in disarray dealing with Brexit on their own, but are they effectively unable to go and maybe respond in kind, maybe not as savagely, but to show that they too have assets on the ground in Moscow?
Just a retaliatory killing? I'm not sure.
I don't know. Other than moral suasion and coming out and saying, we are shocked. We have photos of these two men. Clearly it was brazen. They were photographed everywhere. And I think part of the insult was parading them out in front of state TV afterwards and saying, we're just so traumatized by this. We've been drinking because it's destroyed our privacy. We're just on holiday in London. I mean, is that it? You're just supposed to leave it at that and say, oh, that's Vladimir Vladimir.
My understanding is that what British intelligence did was that they wanted to. British intelligence were very forthcoming unusually forthcoming in how much evidence they had linking those two men to the killing. They had all of the CCTV stuff. They said they knew where they'd stayed. They reconstructed all of it because we have a lot of CCTV TV cameras in Britain, and so if you know what you're looking for in retrospect, you can go and find things. And I think part of the message they were trying to send was you can't do this kind of thing with impunity, because we know more than you think you do, and we will be able to identify.
What happened to you guys? You used to have a navy. You used to attack capitals. You used to come back with your dukes up. Union Jack, just saying, oh, we have CCTV, so shame on you.
Well, I think most people would look back at those periods of, when we went around with gunboat diplomacy and the Opium Wars and said that Mike was right, as, in some ways, it's something that's right that we've moved on from. So imperialism, colonialism, and so
Tom,
on.
I can't quite get your jingoism to
No, exactly.
manifest.
Do you think should we burn the White House down again? We could always do that.
Oh, the country is certainly vulnerable right now. I should take you, though, to Facebook, which is involved in this story as well. And I know you are a tech wonk, and you followed privacy issues and digital creep and whatnot. This was a banner awful year for them publicity-wise, both in the revelations of the enabling that they did in the fixing of the 2016 election and opposition research against somebody like George Soros and Sheryl Sandberg, who was the respectable adult of the company, was kind of brought out. But clearly the company continues. It has had a slowdown in advertising. The stock has taken a huge hit, but I'm not convinced that people have quit Facebook en masse.
No, I think it's kind of become mum book. So young people aren't joining it at all, and so it's the population of Facebook is aging, and as a result, it'll always be there and it'll always have a big group of people, but it's not going to be as important potentially in the future. And Facebook knows this perfectly well. They are switching their attention to Instagram. And the way to think about Instagram is it's sort of Facebook too. Or actually, you could think about it. I used to think about it as an escape pod. It was like if everything went wrong with Facebook, they would essentially separate them, and they would have, like the banks did in the banking crisis. So you put all the bad assets in the bad bank, and then you kind of shut that one down, and you have all the lawsuits, go to that bank, and then meanwhile you kind of try and get as many good assets away into a separate.
Well, don't forget about WhatsApp.
Yeah, well, exactly. So you could.
I mean, WhatsApp, Messenger, Instagram.
Most people do forget about WhatsApp because they aren't aware that it is all the same thing. But Instagram is still growing very fast. Obviously, it's completely stolen Snapchat's lunch. And so I used to think about it as an escape pod, but now I've realized it's more like it's actually a new mothership for Facebook. And I think, Facebook will become the kind of legacy product, and Instagram is going to be where they're putting more and more of their effort. And you can see they're talking about this in earnings calls because they can see that means monetizing ads in the Instagram stories stream. And at the moment, they aren't able to monetize Instagram stories through ads as effectively as they can the Facebook newsfeed. And this is where they were just around the time they did their IPO. They were making most of their money from adverts in the desktop newsfeed. And the big question was whether they were going to be able to make the transition to mobile and whether they would be able to monetize ads on the mobile version of the newsfeed. And of course, the answer was they could. And it turned out that mobile was actually much more valuable than desktop because people spend more time on it and they've got their phones with them all the time and all this sort of thing. So they are painting this, and not without reason, I think, as a similar version of that transition, which is they're going to figure out the right way to monetize stories in Instagram because that's where people are spending more and more of their time. And they also want to add they've added stories to Facebook and WhatsApp, although they're not as used quite as much. But if they can do that, then they've essentially got a chance to reinvent themselves with a new format. And Instagram does have some problems with it, with sort of stuff being passed around on it, but nothing like to the extent of Facebook. It's a much simpler product. So that would potentially allow them to insulate themselves from a lot of these problems by focusing on a product where there are fewer of these sort of things that congressional committees want to delve into. But it's going to take a while, and it's going to be a painful year for them in 2019. There's going to be, the worrying thing if you're in tech is that previously, the Democrats wanted to investigate you, and the Republicans would say no, free enterprise, hands off. And now the Republicans are, if anything, even keener to investigate all the tech companies because they're sure that their algorithms have an inherent anti-right-wing bias, and so everyone hates the tech companies. And this sort of bipartisan hostility is extremely bad news if you are the boss of Facebook or Google or any of these other big tech companies.
And speaking of it, Mark Zuckerberg even bandied about this Iowa tour. Maybe it was 16 months ago, if you can imagine that. I don't understand, looking back to the year 2000, can anybody truly believe that Bill Gates of Microsoft was a villain? In the breakup of Internet Explorer versus Netscape and who had hegemony in the desktop, all of that was mooted, and he left the company and went off, and he's now a hero, philanthropic hero-in-chief, maybe, of the planet. Why doesn't Mark Zuckerberg just leave this to adults and let them clean up the mess he left?
Well, I think Bill Gates' image changed for several reasons. Firstly, the fact that he retired and stepped away from the company that was accused of doing all these things, and then became the greatest philanthropist in world history. Firstly, that counted for something. Secondly, we all realized that the thing that Microsoft then became a much less powerful company. So the thing that we were worrying about, which was that they were going to rule everything, didn't matter so much. People became much. It was like, okay, the internet has arrived and mobile phones have arrived, and Microsoft isn't very good at doing anything with mobile devices, so they got left behind, and everyone started to worry about Google instead, and now Facebook, and so. The world moved on, and now actually one of the great comebacks in corporate history has been what Microsoft's done under its new boss in the last last 3 or 4 years, and I think it's now a more valuable company than the Apple again, isn't it? So it's come back, and as a result, it's come back in a way that doesn't touch people's lives quite so much. It's mainly a cloud services company now. And yes, I have an Xbox and so on. But the thing that people were worried about all the time was that Microsoft was going to kind of own every facet of their lives, the computers they used at work and the devices that they used at home as well. And that kind of fear passed away and now looks quite quaint, I think, because the extent of the data that Facebook and Google hold on us now is absolutely it's far more than Microsoft ever had.
Talk about Facebook and Google. They lord over a veritable duopoly of all advertising. They've sucked all the revenue out of the room. You've seen what's happened to newspapers and the Time magazine world and publications falling left and right, and even marginal players like AOL and Yahoo selling out and saying, our pivot to video didn't work. Even so, and even after Mark Zuckerberg lost more money than any of the world's 500 richest billionaires during 2018, he is still worth more than $50 billion, which has me wondering if it's...
It's still an advertising machine. I mean, Facebook is it's printing money because it controls so much of people's attention. So, I mean, it's often said of Google and Facebook, Google is where you go when you want to get something done, you want to find something out, and they want to get you off their results page as fast as possible. And sometimes that means by clicking on an ad. But, essentially you go to Google to get work done. And Facebook is where you go to kill time. It's like, I've got 5 minutes before my train arrives. So you get Facebook out to waste time. And there's an enormous amount of that kind of, time sponge capacity that people have. And that's an amazingly, in each of their different ways, these are both amazingly lucrative things to be. That duopoly looks quite. People talk about it being challenged, and who will challenge it? Could Snapchat challenge it? I mean, a lot of people supported Snapchat because they wanted a third play here, and people also said Verizon potentially in the US at least, because obviously it has all this data from people's phones, being the biggest wireless carrier, but then it also had AOL and Tumblr and various other properties that it had put together. It's clear now that Verizon has abandoned that. It's written down the value of all those things that it was doing, but that for a while was the plan, that they were going to be the number three to the big two, at least within the US. But at the moment, that doesn't seem. But at the moment, Amazon seems like the biggest challenger. Its advertising business is growing extremely fast, but it's still a way off the other two.
Tom Standage, deputy editor of The Economist, kindly take us to the Middle East. There was a column on Benjamin Netanyahu's battle for survival in Israel. Here he is. He is rather popular. For the many terms he's still been in office. I do not recall another prime minister of Israel having this kind of longevity in the modern era. And yet he does face this sort of Damocles. Was there an ethical transgression? Is the country's attorney general going to come after him? Does he have to declare another election up for grabs? Can he still cobble together a right and right of center coalition to keep him in power? Talk to me about him.
I am struck by how long he's been there and how often he seems to be able to survive these sorts of scandals. But this time it really does look like it's going to be tricky to wriggle out of this one.
Okay, then I will take you to the markets, where we have been in the throes of a correction. Finally, it's happened for the first time, I think, a bear market since 2011. Close enough to a bear market. We're down 19%. And the year starts with some sense of fear and anxiety in markets that there is going to be a reckoning. You have seen a collapse in the price of oil. Where to?
It's not looking good. The word we like to use here is wobbly. It's going to be a wobbly year. And, a lot of people are saying that a recession in the US by the end of 2019 looks quite likely. There are just so many things flashing red at the moment. Obviously, the concerns about the trade war with China and where that's going to go. The stock market's just all over the place. 1 minute it's up, 1 minute it's down. Is it going to surpass the peak of last year? It looks pretty unlikely. I mean, it's the fact that the expansion will have been the longest expansion on record by by July, the longest peacetime in history, longest peacetime expansion in history. So we're overdue a change. The tax cuts last year boosted growth, but that sugar rush is going to wear off this year. And in the meantime, debt interest payments have ballooned. It's going to be 2% of GDP for the US, which is frightening. And then all these companies that have piled on debt when rates were low, rates going up, maybe not as far and as fast as we thought they were going to, but they certainly certainly are going up. And so all of these things point in the same direction. Another factoid that one of my colleagues pointed out is that the last two times that unemployment has been this low in the US, so around 4%, the economy was in a recession a year later. So all of these things say things are probably going to get worse from here. And we know if we look at previous crises, they go up and down. There's a lot of volatility, and we think, oh no, it's coming back, and it's a mess for a year or so, and then everyone realizes, okay, no, we are in a recession. So yeah, it's quite a gloomy outlook, unfortunately.
Tom, I remain struck when I peruse the tables and charts in the back of your issue, The Economist, that the United States Federal Reserve, while it has ratcheted rates up higher over the past several years, you're still below where it was before the financial crisis started. I think they were at a 5.25% target. They're maybe at nearly half that right now, or less than half that. But look at the likes of Switzerland. Look at the Scandinavian countries that still have emergency interest rate policy, many times negative interest rates, in a global economy that's growing. This is not exactly a depressive type environment. I mean, how do you take the bone back from the dog's mouth?
Well, that's what's so worrying, that there's much less room for maneuver when rates are still this low. And yes, they've gone up a bit, but even in the US, they haven't gone up very far. So that's in Europe we resorted to quantitative easing and so on, which also is coming to an end. So that's another reason to kind of to worry. But it means that there is just much less room for maneuver if things do get bad, and that's very concerning. My favorite example of one of the strange consequences of these negative interest rates is in Sweden, people were overpaying their taxes because when you've got negative interest rates in the banks, if you keep money in the bank, then it obviously it goes down. You're charged to store money in the bank. But if you overpay your taxes, the government sits on it for a bit, and then they refund you the amount. And I think for a while, I think they've got rid of it now, but they also had to pay you interest. So the best way to actually earn some interest on your money was to give it to the government for a while as a tax overpayment, and then they'd give it back to you with interest, and you would come out ahead. So yes, there are all sorts of strange things that happen when you end up with negative interest rates, and we've still got them in some places.
And these reminds me of some of the crazy anecdotes you hear out of Venezuela, where people try to contort to preserve any value on their money in a period of hyperinflation, and they hoard used cars or groceries or toilet paper from across the border in Colombia. It's striking to hear about that from the most advanced countries on the planet, that you want to overpay your taxes.
Yeah, no, it is. It is totally bizarre, but that's what they ended up having to do. So, yeah.
Take me to China. You have this furnace that keeps running this economic machine. You have not had a hard landing truly after 2008. They have kept it together. And I wonder, and I've asked so many guests on this show, we've had Jim Chanos, the hedge fund manager, the skeptic on China, is what does happen if China were to have a kind of an unfiltered hard landing? Would it potentially benefit the United States in that it takes the foot off the price pedal, and that oil prices or commodity prices collapse? I mean, after all, we don't depend on China for exports of our wares. Overwhelmingly, they're still trying to convert into a consumer-driven economy, but that has not manifested yet.
Right, but you do rely on them to buy your treasury bonds, so that's quite worrying. And oil prices are already pretty low. This is an interesting year for China because, as is any year with a whole load of nines at the end of it, because they end up having a whole load of anniversaries, and in fact, 2019 is a particularly big year for anniversaries. It's the 100th anniversary of the May the 4th movement, and this was a student uprising that led to the founding of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921. And there's the sort of spirit of May the 4th, and there's a fight over sort of whether the spirit of May the 4th still resides with the Communist Party and with the government, or whether protesters against the government are in fact the sort of true heirs to May the 4th. And this debate happened in 1989, just before this was one of the catalysts for the Tiananmen Square protests, because it was students again who were protesting against the government. So the government's got a bit of it's got to play it very carefully this year because it's trying to sort of stage manage the way that things in its past were remembered. Another one is it's the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic itself. And again, there's a risk that the party and the public will interpret this anniversary in different ways. So I think it's a year to really keep an eye on China because you've got this the trade war going on, and at the moment, the government seems to be directing, concerns about that. It's all America's fault and so on. But what happens if the government if the trade war really starts to hurt and the government is blamed for it? So you've got this sort of intersection of economic and political concerns, particularly this year because of all of these anniversaries. So it's definitely a country to watch.
If I had asked you 30 years ago, let's say 1989 versus 2019, in the wake of the Tiananmen Square massacre, if you could have imagined, if I'd said, I'm going to take you Ghost of Christmas Future, China will have taken hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. We've created an economic colossus that's en route to becoming the world's biggest economy, even in, ultimately in purchasing parity terms. It's an economic machine. It's given people a choice effectively. You can choose the economic route and be capitalist within this structure in kind as long as you do not criticize us. And if anything, it's become much more of an authoritarian state. It's become a surveillance state. It leads the world in tracking technology and facial recognition technology. What would have been the likelihood of that if I had predicted that in 89?
Well, at the time, in 1989, the thing that everyone was talking about was how Japan was about to overtake America. And Japan was, lots of people were frantically learning Japanese. Japan was the second biggest economy in the world and was about to, in theory, overtake America. And then what actually happened was Japan had a massive crash and has subsequently, fallen down the rankings and has been overtaken by China. So some people look at China and say, this, are we making the same mistake again? All those people learning Mandarin, does it really make sense? Look at all the people who learned Japanese in the 80s and now kind of regret it. So I find that historical analogy quite interesting. I think that said, it's less likely. I mean, some people have said I think Martin Wolf has made this point in the FT recently that we shouldn't discount the possibility that actually the growth does stall in China, but I think it does look like a very different situation because China had so much catch-up growth and so rapidly, and the reforms that came in the late 70s and that were starting to bear fruit in 1989 and have had such an astonishing made such an astonishing difference still. That completely transformed the economy, and it's just you go to China and it's like seeing the future. I mean, the facial recognition is a great example of this actually. My favorite example being the way that facial recognition is used in some public loos to prevent people stealing the loo paper. So China is still a poor enough country that if you leave stacks of loo paper in the loo, people will steal them. But it's a sophisticated enough country that it can install machines that dispense a certain amount of loo paper, remember people's faces, and then don't let them have any more loo paper for a certain period. And that kind of tells you right there.
Certainly, Tom, it's downright Orwellian or Kubrickian.
Well, it's not remembering exactly. It's not who they are.
There's a viral video on YouTube, I think, of the Pudong bullet train where you have the announcer come on and say, don't forget that your social credit score is effectively going to be rated if we see any sort of boorish behavior. I mean, I could not have scripted that anymore.
No, it is astonishing. My favorite other example is they give you tickets for jaywalking in some cities, and they have facial recognition cameras, and if they see you going across going across the road, then they say, oh, that person over there, and they send you a ticket. And there was a woman who got one of these tickets. She was it turned out she's the head of one of the big appliance white goods makers in China, and she appears in the adverts for these washing machines or air conditioners or whatever they are, and says you can trust me. Here are my products. And there was a poster of her on the side of a bus advertising things, and the bus drove through an intersection, and a jaywalking camera saw her face on the side of the bus and decided that she was a giant jaywalking bus, and issued her a ticket. And it subsequently turned out that it was her, it was a poster of her, an advert, rather than actually her jaywalking. But yes, they absolutely lead the way in the adoption of this sort of thing. I think China is very likely to lead the way in autonomous vehicles as well. Not necessarily because they'll have the best technology, but because it will be easier to introduce them in an authoritarian state. You'll just say, no human piloted cars in this city, or you have to use these, robo-taxis or whatever. And, it's easier to introduce big new infrastructure structural changes if you've got an authoritarian government like that.
Full disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad. Joining us from London is Tom Standage, deputy editor of The Economist. Sir, in the 10 minutes or so we have left, I let you have open skate, like they used to say in the skating rinks of my childhood. What would you like to talk about? What is being short shrifted? What do you think we're going to be talking about 6 months hence? Anything you'd like to talk about?
There's a few things that interest me that are going on at the moment. One is the sort of revival of interest in space and space technology. And obviously SpaceX is the company that we think about there with low Earth orbits launching and putting satellites up and sending stuff to the space station. But actually the moon is going to be a focus of private space companies in the same way that low Earth orbit has been. And it's pretty much the same playbook from NASA, which is sort of encourage private companies to build systems that could get you to low Earth orbit or to the moon and then pay them to do stuff for you, to take science payloads. And we're going to be seeing a few landers reaching the moon this year. Obviously, it's the 50th anniversary of the first manned landing. There's a Chinese lander. There's an Indian lander due to go there, and the Chinese lander is going to the far side of the moon, which is quite an interesting place to do astronomy because you haven't got the Earth in the messing things up, all the kind of radio signals from the Earth. But the interesting one for me, I think, is the Israeli lander, which is being run by Space IL, which is a non-profit group. So it's a mission to the moon that is not being run by a government space agency, and I think that's we may look back on that as quite significant because once you've got private companies getting interested in this, then all sorts of interesting new things might happen. Also, you've got the prospect of very large constellations of low Earth orbit satellites starting to be launched this year. We're talking about, there's something like I think something like 5,000 satellites have been launched since the beginning of the space age, and I think 2,000 are still up there and 1,000 of them still work. It's something like that. SpaceX is talking about launching about 12,000 satellites, and a rival group called OneWeb wants to launch sort of 4,000 or 5,000 to provide very, very high-speed broadband internet access all over the planet. And that could have very interesting political implications if you can get uncensored, very, very fast internet access wherever you are and governments can't control it. What happens then? So I think this idea of sort of a new commercial frontier in space, which people have talked about for a long time, I think we're starting to get some movement then. And I wonder whether people will look back, later this century and say, oh yes, that was the decade when space started to get going. If you look at what happened in the 20th century, at the beginning of the century, flying machines were for they didn't exist, and then they were only for people who were crazy, and then they were for the very rich, and then they became something that you only notice when it's delayed, and it becomes a kind of a very ordinary thing to do. And I wonder whether the same trajectory we'll see for space. But I find the kind of increasing commercial interest in space a very interesting phenomenon at the moment. And then another area where I think we might be reaching a tipping point is in attitudes towards meat. So a very interesting question I find is to ask what aspect of modern behavior will people find unacceptable or immoral in 20 or 30 years' time? Because there are so many things we look back on in the past and say, oh, how could people have done that? Why did they put up with so much racism or sexism, or why did they tolerate slavery or whatever? So what is it that we do that future generations will think is absolutely inappropriate? And I wonder whether meat eating is quite close to the top of that list. Now, I'm a big fan of eating meat, and I like the taste of it. But if I could have the same taste and it not have to come from an animal, then I'd take that deal. And we're starting to see increasingly sophisticated forms of artificial meat, but we're also seeing them being adopted by big meat companies or by people associated with meat, like McDonald's. So they have a vegan burger and so on. So we're seeing sales of vegan food rising much faster than than people are actually becoming vegan. So sort of part-time veganism is starting to happen. So I think if there are technologies that allow us to have our steak and eat it without having to kill 65 billion animals a year, that would start to change people's minds. And I think you might see people like me who like eating meat and sort of don't think too much about the ethics of factory farming and all the rest of it. But we could see a tipping point there, and we could see a sort of a change in attitudes that starts off in the developed world and then maybe spreads elsewhere. One of the things to note is that something like 1.3 billion people around the world depend on on livestock for for employment and food security. And we worry about the robots coming and taking all of our jobs. But if artificial meat came along and we grew it in vats, which would have enormous environmental benefits because you wouldn't have all of the greenhouse gas emissions.
Methane.
Exactly, methane coming from cows. So, that would be great. But if you did get rid of all of the livestock farming, then that would actually potentially put more than 1 billion people out of work, which is maybe we should be worrying about that rather than robots. But anyway, I think that's, again, something very much worth following. It's one of those kind of, are we coming to a social tipping point in the next 2 or 3 years where more and more people will say, I'm not going to eat meat made from animals, where other forms of artificial meat become cheaper and people start to change their attitudes.
A couple of other tipping points to notice here, and you flicked at kind of the clean tech or green tech aspects of it, is this seems to be the year. 2018 was the year that the plastic straw became taboo. I find that at least all the restaurants you go to, you have to ask for a straw now.
Yes,
it's not assumed they're going to give it to you.
We've pointed out that this is a little bit silly because nearly all of the plastic in the ocean comes from a very small number of Asian countries.
Yes, I've noticed that. That was a great issue within an issue that you put out, that if you could just staunch these 4 or 5 rivers, that would attribute to the bulk of the plastic biomass.
Instead, what's
in the
happening
ocean.
is there's a lot of virtue signaling going on in Europe where everyone is banning single-use plastics and saying this is silly. And actually, that's not going to reduce, because hardly any of that plastic ends up in the ocean anyway. In Europe, it's pretty much all recycled or goes into landfill. So it's a way of, there is a problem with plastic in the ocean, but this is possibly not the way to solve it.
And Tom, you've also covered it. The Juul, which has really taken the crown of vaping this year. There has been a tipping point away from cigarettes. I don't know if it's the case in Europe and certainly not in developing economies here, but enough for Altria, the parent of Philip Morris USA, to make a significant investment in the company to kind of bet the ranch on it.
No, exactly. And I think that's an interesting shift too, because vaping doesn't seem to have the social stigma associated with cigarette smoking because it doesn't have the secondary consequences as far as anyone can tell. And it also doesn't smell. I mean, the smell of cigarettes gives me a headache, but vaping is a different thing. So that does seem to be a change in attitude. And it's a significant move, the fact that Philip Morris has made this investment, because they had their own rival e-cigarette product. I don't know if they're keeping that one going.
No,
but
they're gonna shut that down, and you might see a transcontinental merger again of Philip Morris and Philip Morris International. One more for you is the internal combustion engine. Everybody had pegged such high hopes on Elon Musk's Model 3 Tesla, and he had a volatile year. And is this the man who's going to save the world and kill the internal combustion engine? And it didn't quite happen yet.
Well, I think they're doing pretty well. I mean, I think Tesla's the biggest selling luxury brand of car in the US now, so it's outselling Mercedes and BMW. And I think Tesla manages to make more electric cars in a week than GM makes in a year. So I know the big car companies say, it's really hard, and we've seen how difficult it's been for Tesla to scale up production. And the big car companies say, yes, well, we've had years of experience, we know how to mass produce things, but they seem not to be doing it because there doesn't seem to be as much demand for their electric vehicles. So I think, whatever happens to what people say that will Elon Musk stay on as CEO of Tesla? Will he get booted out? What will happen? I don't think you can deny that he has changed the trajectory for the adoption and the development of electric cars. He's made electric cars sexy. He's made them cool. And even if Tesla ends up being bought out by someone else, then that will still be the case. But the other thing about him is he does seem to have this something of a messiah complex, which is only I can save. Well, it's not only I can save the world. He wouldn't put it like that. But he does seem to fixate on big problems, and he likes the idea that he can fix them, and that's great that he's trying to do something about changing the trajectory of the energy system. But more recently, he's decided that they need his help to rescue boys from a cave in Thailand, or traffic in LA is completely terrible, but he's the man to fix the problem. And he's already spread himself very thin between the companies that he has already. Oh, that's right. He's also going to save humanity from the AI apocalypse. So
maybe perhaps he could figure out Brexit. Good sir, Tom Standage, deputy editor of The Economist, I cannot thank you enough for spending this hour with us.
You're very welcome. It's been great. Thank you.
Full disclosure, our engineer is John Valentine. Special thanks to WCVE. You can catch all episodes of Full Disclosure on NPR One and on iTunes at link fulldradio.com. Additionally, you should visit Twitter at Full D Radio for info on upcoming live events. Happy New Year. I'm Robin Farzad, back with you next week.